What's up, everybody? This is Fred Richani. In this interview, we chat with filmmaker Jason Loftus of Eternal Spring, the critically acclaimed documentary, now playing at the NYC Film Forum and in theaters nationwide October 21st.
当然还有很多在那种寒冷冬天下那种人与人之间的友谊，小朋友之间的、亲人之间的那种非常温暖的感觉。我当时在那个插播之后，他们跟着我。 所以我觉得也是我们该离开的时候了。
我们唯一的诉求就是要通过一种方式讲述一种真相。
任其迫害，大家谁也不说话。他杀人放火了，那你是人吗？
当我画的时候呢，其实我作为一个专业的从业人员的时候，我并不难。但是当我在体会当时那种带回那种回忆的时候呢，我有一种很沉重的被压抑的感觉。
Well, Jason, we just checked out the trailer for Eternal Spring, critically acclaimed documentary, very unique concept here. A very heavy story indeed, involves art, involves politics, expression, has a lot to do kind of with what's going on in China these days as well. How did you come up with the concept for Eternal Spring?
You know, it was interesting. We were making a Kung Fu video game a number of years ago, and we wanted to use a lot of hand-drawn comic book art for this sort of visual novel component we were including. And we heard about this artist. He was living in New York at the time, originally from China. His name's Daxiong. And he'd drawn for Justice League and Star Wars, and he'd also worked with the leading Kung Fu novelist in China, a man named Jin Yong. So we thought it's perfect. The guy's got the cultural background, he's got this amazing artistic ability. And we brought him up to our studio in Toronto, and we were working together. And then we learned that Daxiong came from the same hometown as my wife and filmmaking partner, Masha Loftus, which is a city in northeast China called Changchun. Now, Masha had no connection with the Falun Gong community that Daxiong was part of. She was the daughter of a mid-level government official. So she hadn't really had any insights into what, you know, the dissidents and any repressed group were experiencing sort of under her nose in her own city. And hearing Daxiong's story and this remarkable tale of, you know, leaving his home behind, having been detained and tortured and, you know, having to flee and leave his comic book studio and life sort of in shambles, all because of this dramatic hijacking of the state TV airways, and just hearing what people in this community had been suffering. I think it really hit home for her. For me, when I was in high school, I had an interest in Eastern meditation and philosophy, and I had come across the Falun Gong community and Falun Gong back then, which was before there was any crackdown in China. And being in high school, I had no knowledge of the Chinese political system. So a year later, they started persecuting Falun Gong in China, and I was hearing all this, you know, Falun Gong is evil and dangerous, and we need to get rid of it. And it just didn't reconcile with my own experiences or my own encounters with the community. So I think for me, that planted this seed of concern for the human rights situation in China and sort of an interest in looking it further into the subject. And so I think between the two of us, when Daxiong sort of fell into our laps with this project, and he had this amazing story and he seemed to be ready, he wanted to explore it. We just thought it was a story we should tell. I think also from a filmmaking perspective, you know, the idea, I mean, I've seen animation used in documentary before. I mean, Flea was a big hit last year. I didn't see it, unfortunately, until I'd finished my work on this film, so I can't claim it as inspiration, but I did really enjoy the film. I thought it was beautiful. But there are films that I enjoyed, you know, earlier. If you go back to Waltz with Bashir or Tower, even, that used kind of rotoscoping method, I've seen different styles used, and I think it can be a very effective tool in documentaries. But what excited me with this story and with this project was the animation that I normally see is kind of this decision by the invisible hand of the director. We just see the animation, it's stylistic, it's great, but we don't know who's making these illustrations. We don't know who's really kind of putting what interpretations they're making or how that all plays into what we're seeing on screen. And I just felt this was an amazing opportunity to pull the curtain back and to really see an artist who personally is deeply affected by an event that itself is really harrowing and exciting, right? And has human rights implications and all that, but something that personally affected him. And we could explore how he approaches that through his art. And I think this is interesting because then you can see how, the pain of torture and the trauma and such affects his art. And you could see how, the longing and nostalgia that he has for his hometown is reflected in how he recreates those moments. And we see that all playing out on screen. And then you see how this process of drawing these individuals and himself learning about this event that impacted his life and why these people did what they did helps him to come to some kind of new understanding. And to me, that speaks to the power that art can play. And I was really excited about kind of going on this journey and felt really, fortunate that Daxiong was also willing to explore this and really communicate through his pen.
Yeah, much respect to him. He's a phenomenal artist, but man, the amount of trauma that man went through is absolutely crazy. So prior to the making of this documentary, when you just found out about this, did he ever talk about this publicly? Or was this the first time he really kind of revealed his role in all of this?
He was known for his, sometimes political art. I knew that he had a background as a bit of a, dissident artist, or that he had been some kind of at odds with the Chinese authorities, was aware that he practiced Falun Gong and that, but I didn't know his connection to these events and the TV hijacking. And again, he wasn't someone who directly climbed the poles and hijacked them, but even just the ramifications and the implications for so many people. I mean, they arrested thousands of people in this aftermath, and as he describes it, they would kill 1,000 people just to find the person. Once this happened and someone had broken this monopoly on the control of information inside China, the authorities were willing to kind of, leave no stone unturned, and they weren't concerned about, any harm to innocent people. That wasn't something that crossed their minds. They just wanted to make sure they got everybody who was involved and sent a warning to anyone else who might think about doing something like this in the future to never even try it. So he was impacted by that deeply. And it was interesting to me, too, because there's this unresolved question at the outset. He's obviously sympathetic to the efforts of fellow Falun Gong practitioners to sort of counter the state propaganda messaging that they had been subjected to and sort of get their own voice out there. He was on side with that. But he also felt, did we poke the bear here? Was like the hammer came down so hard, the human cost was so high that he had these misgivings. And I felt that's interesting because probably a lot of people would approach that. I'm curious to kind of explore this question and see where it goes. So I think from a film perspective, that sort of question at the beginning was very useful because then we get to see how he comes to understand this group and what they did as he gets to meet people who were closer and closer to the event, including, one of the actual TV hijackers who we were fortunately able to find in Korea.
But I would imagine with a story of this magnitude, there has to be some nuance as well, because there could still be parties to this day that are affected. So how hard was it as a filmmaker to kind of walk that line and be careful that some of the information that you did share didn't put some other people in danger or kind of affect any of the parties?
Yeah, thank you for raising that. I think it is something that you need to be concerned about, when you're dealing with real life subjects, that you're not, especially people who've experienced torture and trauma, that you're not doing anything that is going to subject them to any further harm. And so this is something you approach when you begin speaking with people. You need to make sure that they're not only willing, but that they genuinely want to tell their story and that they've thought through whatever potential consequences might be. Now, I think in most cases, they know a lot better than I do what the situation is and what the consequences that they are going to face are. But this is something you explore to make sure that you ethically feel that you're helping, not hurting anyone, right? But it was interesting for me, this process. I learned a lot through it because, for one, you would meet these survivors who would be, they're basically like, I went through so much already, and I was speaking out when I was inside of China, and that's why I suffered all this torture, and that's why my friends are dead, right? So you're asking me whether you're sure I want to do this here now that I'm outside in the West. It's like for them, they had already been through so much to be able to tell their story. So they really relished the opportunity to share what they had been through. It was something they really wanted to do. But I think beyond that too, they also felt that the best recourse they had was to shine a light on the situation. And I'll give you an example. I had interviewed a gentleman who was tortured in a Chinese labor camp rather brutally, and his circumstances had improved at some point. And he didn't know at the time why. But when he was able to get out of China, he later learned that his family members had his name mentioned in media reports overseas. He was listed in a human rights report. In some cases, what people will do even is they'll get the phone numbers of labor camps where they know that abuses are taking place. And from outside of China, sort of Chinese expatriates will call the labor camps and say, hey, we know what you're doing to so-and-so. And so these guards, even though they might be encouraged internally to mete out these abuses, to get, the detainees to sort of comply with whatever the Communist Party's dictates are, when they're aware that people outside of China know what they're doing, and that actually really does have a restraining effect on the abuses. And so what I learned from that was that like the spotlight was actually the best they felt that they could do. So they felt it would help the other people there, and it would help the situation if we could shine a light on what was happening. And so everyone who appears in the film obviously has done that, not just with a willingness, but that they genuinely wanted to participate in this film and tell their story.
Hey, well, you all did a fantastic job. I just want to make a note here at the time for anybody watching or listening to this. Premiering in theaters at the Film Forum in New York City this Friday, and nationwide in select theaters October 21st. Also, from what I understand, submitted for Academy Award consideration, which is huge. I found this very powerful. I thought with the artwork, it was super unique, along with the kind of live action elements and everything else. And I know as a filmmaker, you want this to do well, you want this to resonate. But are you even a little surprised at how well it's resonated with people?
It's a great question, because you don't know when you work on something. And this, as an independent team, this one we chipped away at for 5 to 6 years. We were doing something kind of original. We did other productions and other work along the way, but we just had a small dedicated team constantly working away at this to try and realize our vision for it. And, you put your heart into it. You obviously, there's something that resonates with you as a filmmaker, and you just want to convey that to audiences, but you don't know if they're going to have that same experience, in 90 minutes that you have when you have the opportunity to engage with the individuals directly and through all that. And you do everything you can to hopefully convey that within the confines of a film. And so I found it really, really rewarding when we started the festival run. Our premiere was at Thessaloniki in Greece, a great documentary festival they have there. And, first screening we had finished, and the audience was just silent. And I was like, well, what do they think? I don't know. And then you realize that they were really sort of deeply processing what was in there, because the Q&A started and the questions were just, they were rather profound. I felt people were really thinking about not just the individuals in the film and the story, but some of the themes and the ideas in there. And it was really moving for me, because, they had to cut the Q&A off. We just ran out of time. And then people were continuing it with me in the foyer. And, one lady comes up to me and says it might be the best documentary she's ever seen, and that she was sort of shaking through the entire experience. And, as a filmmaker, I don't know if she knew how much that meant to me. It's like your first exposure to an audience, and this is the kind of response that you're getting from people. It was, we went through different difficulties with this, I have to say. So, I mentioned that we connected with Daxiong around a Kung Fu video game that we were producing. That video game was being published by Tencent, which is a major media company inside China and a huge player in the gaming space internationally. And in the midst of making this film and one other human rights project at the same time, our game was being launched, and it just disappeared from the storefronts on Tencent's platform, the WeGame platform. And we were like, what's going on here? And when we finally reached our rep over there, I was told, it's not the game. It had already been approved by the censorship bureaus in 2 different ministries of the Chinese government. There's something with you and your company. And they were forced to cut ties with my company. And I was asked, are you doing something not aligned with the Chinese government direction? And then at the same time, the Public Security Bureau started contacting my wife's family and harassing them. And so you face all these things, and you're like, going down this road and telling these stories, it has consequences. But at this, you've met Daxiong, you spent time with him, you've met these other survivors, you realize what they went through to tell their story. And you're like, how can we not tell the story with the freedom that we have and with the protections that we have? How can we not help them tell their story? So you make that decision, and you feel it's the right thing. you feel ethically that that's the right approach, but you don't know how audiences are going to respond to it. And then when you start to get this kind of response with all the awards we've had, and as you mentioned, it's Canada's entry for the Oscars in the international feature category, which is the first documentary that Canada has ever chosen to represent, the first animated film and the first Mandarin film. It was just a huge honor. When you get this kind of response, it's really heartening. It seems like other people also feel, these are subjects that we need to be able to talk about. Maybe it's been a little bit too long that we've been wary of upsetting China, for loss of, in the entertainment space, for loss of an important market and stuff. But there are remarkable Chinese people who are doing heroic things, in my opinion, to stand up to the abuses and try and create a better and fairer future there. And their stories deserve to be told.
Absolutely. Very well said. Well, Jason, we really do appreciate the time. For anybody that's still on the fence, why should people watch Eternal Spring?
For me, this gets back to something that, I take from Aristotle, this idea, that history deals with specifics or particulars, and poetry, which in my mind is how we communicate in when we're telling films too, is the concepts in the poetics. It deals with universals. You have to find something that's universal. It's not just for a group of people with a specific vested interest in a subject already. And that isn't to belittle the importance or the significance of the persecution of Falun Gong that's going on in China, or religious persecution in general. But I think there's something universal here. I mean, this is an extreme case of the courage that's required to speak up in the face of an injustice. But we often all face this on a much smaller scale. We see something that isn't right, or we know we should do something, but it's just like, where do we get that courage and that fortitude to be able to do it? And I think anyone who shares that very kind of common human experience can take something away from this film, seeing how these individuals responded to overwhelming odds and great risks. But despite all of that, pulled off something that I think is rather remarkable and heroic.
Very well said. Well, Jason, thank you so much for your time. Before we let you go, where can we find you in Eternal Spring next and online?
Keep following us at eternalspringfilm.com. The film has sold to Vice. You'll be able to catch it, but still not for quite a while. We're only in theaters at this point, but the theatrical release is expanding into different countries. So people who are checking this out from different locations, check out our website. I think the theatrical will be in like 8 countries now, and it's continuing to grow. So check us out there. And you can sign up for our newsletter and such, all in that same place, eternalspringfilm.com.